When I first moved into this neighborhood, I thought the homeowners association was just one of those things you put up with. Pay the dues, keep the grass trimmed, wave at the neighbors during the annual meeting, and move on with your life. That's what I expected. What I didn't expect was how quickly the rules would become less about order and more about control. It started with the small stuff. A letter slipped under the door about my lawn being a little too long. Another notice about my trash can sitting out by the curb for a few extra hours. I shrugged it off at first. I figured, okay, maybe I'll just be more careful. Everyone gets these notes once in a while, right? But soon I realized it wasn't once in a while. It was constant. I'd mow the grass, and the next day I'd get a letter saying it wasn't short enough. I'd park my car in my own driveway just a little too close to the edge, and another notice would arrive. They even cited me for a garden hose left visible on the side of my house, coiled up like any other hose you'd find in any other yard. It was like they were searching for reasons to remind me who was in charge. At first I laughed it off, but over time the humor disappeared. The tone of their letters wasn't just corrective, it was aggressive, sharp, designed to make me feel like I was under their thumb. Pretty soon I started noticing things I hadn't before. HOA board members walking past my house a little slower than usual, like they were inspecting every inch of it. Cars creeping by at odd hours. Not neighbors coming home from work, but vehicles I didn't recognize. When I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me, as though someone was always waiting to catch me in the act of breaking one of their endless rules. It gave me this gnawing feeling in my stomach, the kind you get when you know you're being watched but you can't prove it. Home, the one place that's supposed to feel safe, started to feel like a spotlight. I tried to play their game. I went to meetings, I asked questions, I kept everything polite. I wanted to show them I wasn't some careless neighbor ignoring the rules, but none of it mattered. Their responses were clipped, dismissive, as though they'd already decided I was the problem. The more effort I put in, the less it seemed to help. It was like reasoning with a wall. I could see it in their eyes during the meetings. They didn't want cooperation, they wanted obedience. There's a difference. And that difference started to eat at me every single day. Friends would say, "Just pay the fines, it's easier." But why should I have to pay for a hose on the side of my house? Why should I let them bully me over where I place my garbage bin? I'd worked hard for this home. It was mine, and I wasn't about to roll over for a group of neighbors who got drunk on a little bit of power. So I pushed back. I ignored the petty notices. I refused to pay fines that were nothing more than intimidation tactics, and I could tell that decision made me a target. The letters got nastier. They weren't just reminding me of rules anymore. They were threatening me with further action. They used vague but heavy words like compliance and authority. They wanted me to believe they had more power than they did, and maybe that's what worried me the most. If they were willing to push this far, where else would they go? I started to wonder if they'd try something bigger, something that would really make me bend. And then one night, as I was sitting in my living room, that knock on the door came. A sharp, deliberate knock that didn't feel like a neighbor or a delivery. It felt official. And in that moment, I knew the HOA had taken things to the next level. I just didn't know yet how badly it was about to backfire. That night, the knock on the door didn't sound like any ordinary visitor. It was firm, heavy, almost rehearsed, like someone trying to project authority before they'd even said a word. I hesitated for a moment, looked through the peephole, and my heart skipped. Two men stood there, both dressed in dark uniforms with shiny badges pinned to their chests. They had radios clipped to their shoulders, belts that looked like they carried equipment, and the kind of posture that said they wanted me to believe they were in charge. For a split second, I thought maybe something serious had happened in the neighborhood. But the moment I opened the door and they spoke, that feeling shifted into unease. The taller one said they were there to discuss a violation. His tone wasn't professional. It was sharp, like he was already accusing me of something. He gestured toward the yard and asked if I could step outside to talk. I'd dealt with real police officers before, and I knew the rhythm of their conversations. This wasn't it. Something about the way they carried themselves didn't sit right. They had the look down, badges, uniforms, radios, but when you've seen the real thing, you can sense the difference. Their badges were generic, almost too shiny, like something bought off the internet. Their radios never once made a sound. And their boots, instead of looking worn like someone who worked in them daily, looked brand new. As I stood in the doorway, I felt the tension rise in my chest. I asked what violation they were talking about. And instead of giving me a clear answer, they danced around it, saying things like, "You know what this is about? And it'll go easier if you cooperate." That was my first red flag. Real officers don't play games like that. They tell you straight up what the problem is. These guys were acting like enforcers, not professionals. I glanced at their name tags, and that's when I noticed something else that set off alarm bells. The names were just first initials and last names. No department, no city, no identification number. I asked them what agency they were with, and one of them just muttered, "Local enforcement." Local enforcement? That's not a department. That's not even a real term. My stomach turned, and the thought crept in. Were these guys even cops at all? Still, I didn't want to provoke them. I leaned against the door frame and kept my responses short, trying to get a read on them. The shorter one kept glancing around nervously, like he was checking if anyone else was watching. The taller one kept pressing me to step outside, and every time I refused, his tone got harsher. I could feel the pressure building, the sense that they were trying to corner me into making a mistake. My instincts screamed that something was wrong, but I held my ground, telling them I wasn't going anywhere until I saw some real identification. That's when the atmosphere shifted. The taller one sighed and pulled out his badge again, holding it up close to my face, as if the glare of the metal would make me stop asking questions. But the closer I looked, the faker it seemed. It didn't have the seal I'd expect, no department name, no weight to it. It was the kind of badge you'd find in a costume shop, and once I noticed that, I couldn't unsee it. I looked back at him and didn't hide the doubt in my voice when I asked again where exactly they were from. The pause that followed told me everything I needed to know. They weren't real. They weren't cops. They were two men in uniforms playing dress-up, and the realization sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't random. This wasn't a misunderstanding. Someone had sent them here, and I already had a pretty good idea who. The longer I stood in that doorway, the more obvious it became that something wasn't right. Their uniforms looked convincing from a distance, but up close the stitching was uneven, and the patches didn't match the ones I'd seen on real local officers. The radios they wore were silent, not a single crackle of dispatch chatter, and their so-called utility belts looked more like props than gear. They were trying so hard to act official, but the cracks were showing, and the more I noticed, the more uneasy I felt. When I asked them again for identification, they shifted their weight, avoided eye contact, and gave me the same vague answer about being with local enforcement. That phrase echoed in my head, and it only made the whole thing sound more like a bad performance. They kept pushing me to step outside. The taller one leaned in close and lowered his voice, telling me it would be easier if I cooperated. Easier for who, I wondered. Real cops don't talk like that. Real cops don't need you to step outside to tell you what's going on. I could feel the tension in the air growing heavier with every second. My gut told me to slam the door and call the actual police, but there was something about the way they were posturing that made me hesitate. It was like they were waiting for me to slip, to react, to make their job easier. But what exactly was their job? That was the part that chilled me. If they weren't real, then what were they planning to do once I was out on the porch with them? I watched their body language closely. The shorter one wouldn't stand still. His eyes kept darting around, scanning the street like he was making sure nobody else was watching. His hand hovered awkwardly near his belt, like he wanted to look prepared but didn't actually know how to carry himself. The taller one, on the other hand, kept pressing forward, invading my space, trying to use intimidation to mask the fear that I could now clearly see in his eyes. They were both nervous, both out of their depth, but determined to hold the act together long enough to scare me into compliance. I kept my responses calm, almost flat, but inside my chest my heart was pounding. Every instinct screamed that these men didn't belong here. They weren't here on official business, they were here to put on a show. And the more they talked, the more obvious it became that they didn't know the script. They spoke in generalities, throwing around phrases like neighborhood violations and serious consequences, but they never once named a specific issue. They couldn't because they weren't real cops, and this wasn't real authority. It was theater. As I stood there, it hit me just how calculated the whole thing was. The HOA had been escalating for weeks, piling on letters and threats, trying to push me into submission. Now here were two men in fake uniforms, standing on my porch, doing their best impression of law enforcement. It was intimidation, pure and simple, and it was working, but not in the way they intended. I wasn't scared of them anymore. I was furious. The audacity of showing up at my home in front of my family, pretending to be something they weren't, it crossed every line. Still, I knew I couldn't lose my cool. That's what they were counting on. If I lashed out or made the wrong move, they'd twist it, maybe even try to use it against me. So I held my ground, refusing to give them what they wanted. I didn't step outside, I didn't raise my voice. I just kept repeating the same thing. Show me proper identification. And every time I said it, their confidence cracked a little more. Their act was crumbling piece by piece. It was like a game of chicken, each of us waiting to see who would break first. But what they didn't know was that the balance of power was about to shift in a way they couldn't possibly recover from. Because right behind me, in the next room, someone else had been listening. Someone who didn't just sense they were fake, someone who knew it. And the moment she stepped forward, their whole charade was going to collapse. I didn't even hear her footsteps at first. I was too locked into this strange standoff, watching these two men sweat through their fake performance. But then, from behind me, I felt the shift in the air. The kind of shift you only notice when someone walks into a room with real authority. My wife stepped forward, calm and collected, not rattled by the show these guys were putting on. She looked at them once, just once, and I knew she had already read the entire situation. Years of experience had trained her eye to spot the difference between real and fake in a heartbeat. And these two didn't stand a chance. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't puff her chest out. She just asked them directly to show proper identification. Not the little trinkets they had been flashing, but real, official ID. The taller one shifted uncomfortably, trying to bluff his way through it. He muttered something about us, knowing why they were here and not making it more difficult. My wife didn't even flinch. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her badge, and flipped it open with the kind of precision that comes from doing it thousands of times before. The gleam of that U.S. Marshal badge caught the porch light, and in that single second the entire dynamic flipped on its head. The silence that followed was heavy. Those two men froze like statues, their rehearsed lines dying on their tongues. My wife didn't have to explain anything. Her badge did the talking. She stared at them, her expression calm but unshakably firm, and asked the question that stripped away whatever scraps of authority they thought they had left. Now tell me, who exactly are you supposed to be? It was like watching a balloon deflate. The taller one's shoulders slumped, and the shorter one's eyes went wide, darting from my wife's badge back to my face like he was calculating how quickly he could get out of there. The act was done. Their fake authority crumbled in an instant, exposed for the lie it was. These weren't cops. They weren't even close. They were just two men in borrowed uniforms, caught in a game they never should have been playing. My wife took a step closer, and that tiny move was enough to break whatever was left of their resolve. The shorter one stammered something about misunderstanding, but it was nonsense. He couldn't even finish a sentence. The taller one glanced at him, and I saw the panic in his eyes. They had been sent here to intimidate us, but they had walked straight into a trap of their own making. They had no idea that the person they thought they could bluff was a federal officer trained to handle situations far more dangerous than two imposters on a suburban doorstep. I'll never forget the way they looked in that moment. The confidence, the fake authority, the smugness they carried when they first knocked on the door, it was gone. What was left was fear. My wife didn't have to yell, didn't have to threaten, didn't even have to step all the way onto the porch. All it took was that badge and her steady voice, and the whole charade collapsed. I stood there, almost in awe, because in the span of a few seconds, the power shifted completely. They weren't the ones in control anymore. We were. My wife didn't blink, didn't soften, just held her ground like she had done it 100 times before. And in that silence, those two so-called officers realized the truth. The game was over, and they were in way over their heads. They exchanged a quick look, a look that said more than words ever could. It was the look of men deciding whether to keep up the act or cut their losses. And the decision came fast. Without another word, they started backing up. First a step, then another, until they turned on their heels. And that's when I knew. They weren't going to talk their way out of this. They were going to run. The second they turned to leave, the tension snapped like a rubber band pulled too tight. One moment they were standing there trying to bluff their way through, the next they were practically stumbling over each other to get off the porch. I watched their fake confidence vanish with every hurried step they took. The taller one muttered something under his breath, something about us misunderstanding, but his voice cracked halfway through the excuse. The shorter one didn't even bother speaking. He was already moving fast, head down, eyes darting like a guilty kid caught stealing. They made it down the walkway and onto the street in record time, not once daring to look back at us. My wife just stood there, badge still in hand, calm and unshaken. Me? I was frozen for a second, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. Grown men dressed as cops, sent to my house to intimidate us, running away like cornered animals the second they realized they'd picked the wrong target. Their car was parked a few houses down, and the way they scrambled into it told me everything I needed to know. They weren't professionals. They weren't trained. They weren't prepared for confrontation with someone who could see right through them. They were pretenders, and now that their act had been exposed, they wanted nothing more than to disappear. The engine roared louder than it needed to, like the sound of panic on four wheels. And just like that, they sped down the street, tail lights shrinking into the night until they were gone. The silence that followed was almost eerie. For weeks, maybe months, the HOA had been escalating, turning every small thing into a battle, building up to this moment. And here it was, over in less than a minute once my wife stepped in. I closed the door slowly, the sound of the latch echoing in the quiet house, and turned to her. She didn't gloat. She didn't laugh. She just gave me that look she always does when she's seen through a situation before anyone else. A look that said, "You knew they'd break, didn't you?" And the truth was, she had known from the second she saw them. We sat down, both of us still processing the insanity of what had just happened. It wasn't just a prank or a misunderstanding. These men had been sent here to intimidate us, to make us feel small, to pressure us into submission. That wasn't random. That wasn't coincidence. That was orchestrated. And while the HOA would never admit it, who else could it have been? Who else had the motive, the grudge, and the nerve to try something like that? We didn't waste time. The first call we made was to the actual police department. My wife explained everything. Her credentials, what happened, how the imposters tried to pass themselves off as officers, how they fled when confronted. The officer on the other end of the line didn't sound surprised. He sounded tired, like someone who'd heard a lot of stories and seen a lot of petty cruelty dressed up as seriousness. The officer on the line listened while my wife calmly laid out what had happened. The imposters at the door, the fake badges, the way they bolted when confronted. He took down details, descriptions, the direction the men had driven off, the make and color of the car. He told us they'd send a patrol to canvass the neighborhood and asked if we could hang on to any evidence, photos of the men, the license plate if we could catch it, anything. We promised to do what we could. The act of making that call felt like closing the loop on something ugly. It was an official record now, not just a story we were left to stew over. After we hung up, the reality of what had happened started to settle in. Adrenaline ebbed and left a sort of hollow where fear had been, replaced by an aftertaste of anger and disbelief. Who thinks it's okay to stage a scene at someone's front door? Who thinks frightening a family is a reasonable enforcement tactic? Those questions hung between us. We talked strategy, legal counsel, documented everything, archived copies of the letters and notices, every email exchange with the HOA. We started jotting down names of board members who had been unusually persistent. Any conversations that had felt more like pressure than concern for rules. If the HOA wanted to play games, we decided we'd be ready to take it into the light. Neighbors started calling the next day. Some wanted to commiserate. Others admitted they'd had similar run-ins, but were too afraid to push back. One woman told me she'd been too intimidated to plant flowers because she'd received a letter about inappropriate landscaping months ago. Another man confessed he'd paid fines rather than fight because he didn't want the hassle. Hearing those stories made me realize this wasn't just about our house. It was about a culture of fear that had quietly spread across the block. It made the stunt feel larger, more malicious, and more in need of exposure. We filed a formal complaint with the HOA as well, not that I expected them to answer honestly. Their initial response was predictably vague. An email denying involvement, offering a bland statement about community safety and contracted representatives. But their words didn't match what had happened on our porch. They couldn't explain how two men in fake uniforms had the gall to knock on our door and act like law enforcement. They couldn't explain who hired them. They offered no apology, no accountability. That silence said the thing their email wouldn't. They were embarrassed, and they wanted to hide it. As the days went on, the immediate pressure eased, but the ripples stayed. We kept records, we talked to neighbors, and eventually the police called back to say they were following leads. Whether that would lead anywhere remained to be seen. What mattered more, to me, was that we no longer felt like victims who had to quietly accept whatever the HOA decided. Confrontation had consequences for the instigators, and the evidence existed now, in the eyes of an officer, in the notes of a report, in the memory of two imposters who'd run away. There was power in that documentation, power in making the incident more than gossip. I replay the night sometimes, not to relive the fear, but to remind myself of how fragile fake authority is when faced with honesty and preparedness. Those men had borrowed symbols of power and expected them to work like armor. They hadn't counted on circumstances not scripted for their theatrics, the steady voice of someone who knew how to read people, the presence of a badge held by someone who actually earned it, or the fact that truth and patience can dismantle pretense quicker than anger ever could. There are lessons here beyond the immediate drama. One is practical. Document everything. Call the real authorities when imposters appear, and never let intimidation be normalized. Another is more human. Communities can rot when a few decide that control is more important than neighborliness, and it takes more than letters to rebuild trust once it's been weaponized. We didn't want to humiliate anyone. We wanted safety, fairness, and a neighborhood where people weren't made to feel small in their own homes. In the weeks that followed, the HOA's tone shifted in subtle ways. The letters we received were fewer, the board meetings more formal, and some people who had been loudest in their enforcement grew quieter. Maybe they learned something from that night. Maybe they didn't. Still, every time I walk past that porch now, there's a small satisfaction in knowing the truth played out. Imposters and intimidation don't hold up when exposed to daylight. If you're watching this and you've ever felt bullied, by rules or by people who use rules as power, know this and document it, stand together, and don't be afraid to call out imposters. Authority isn't a costume you can put on to make people obey. It's something earned, and when the mask slips, it falls apart fast. If you like this story and want more real-life neighborhood dramas and hidden history, subscribe and drop your own HOA horror stories in the comments. We'll read them, and you might even hear yours in a future episode.